I begin to see a deeper pattern when I look at why so many families are struggling today. It is not simply a matter of disagreement, stress, money, or changing social conditions. Those factors certainly play a role, but beneath them lies something much more subtle. We are living inside psychological silos that shape the way we see ourselves, the way we interpret reality, and ultimately the way we relate to the people closest to us. The challenge is that most of us do not even realize the silo exists. We assume our perception is reality itself. We assume our emotional reactions are objective truths. And because of that assumption, we unknowingly build invisible walls between ourselves and the people we love. When I study both modern neuroscience and ancient understandings of human behavior, I find remarkable agreement on one principle. Human beings do not respond directly to reality. We respond to our interpretation of reality. Every experience we have passes through layers of belief, memory, expectation, and emotion before it becomes meaningful. This means two people can witness the exact same event and walk away with entirely different conclusions. Inside a family, this creates an invisible separation that grows over time. One person feels unheard, another feels unappreciated. One believes they are protecting the family, another believes they are being controlled. Both perspectives feel completely real because each person is viewing life from within their own silo. What makes this especially important is that the body participates in this process. Many people think beliefs exist only in the mind, but biology tells a different story. Every thought generates chemistry. Every emotional pattern influences hormones, neural pathways, and even the way the nervous system responds to the environment. When a person repeatedly experiences fear, disappointment, resentment, or rejection, those emotions become familiar. The body learns them. Eventually, the body begins expecting them. At that point, reactions become automatic. A simple conversation can trigger a defensive response long before conscious reasoning has a chance to intervene. This is one reason family conflicts often feel so confusing. People tell themselves they are arguing about dishes, schedules, finances, or responsibilities, yet the emotional intensity is often far greater than the situation itself would justify. What is actually happening is that deeper emotional memories are being activated. The nervous system is responding to years of accumulated experiences. A single comment becomes connected to dozens of previous moments stored within the body and mind. The present becomes entangled with the past. I find it fascinating that ancient cultures understood this dynamic without the technology we possess today. They recognized that unresolved emotional patterns could distort perception. They taught that clarity requires self-awareness because what we see in the world often reflects what exists within us. Modern psychology now describes similar mechanisms through cognitive bias, emotional conditioning, and subconscious programming. Different language, same observation. The state of our inner world influences how we experience our outer relationships. The silo becomes even stronger when technology enters the equation. Never before have human beings had such unprecedented access to information. Yet information alone does not create understanding. In many cases, it creates further isolation. Algorithms learn our preferences and continuously feed us content that reinforces existing beliefs. Over time, our worldview becomes increasingly narrow while feeling increasingly complete. We begin surrounding ourselves with ideas that confirm what we already think. As this happens, empathy starts to weaken. The ability to genuinely understand another perspective becomes more difficult because we rarely practice it. Inside families, this effect can be profound. Parents and children may live under the same roof while inhabiting entirely different psychological realities. Each person is receiving different information, different influences, different emotional conditioning. Conversations that once created connection now become battlegrounds of competing narratives. The tragedy is that most participants genuinely want love and harmony, yet their internal filters prevent them from recognizing the humanity behind the opposing viewpoint. What I have learned is that healing does not begin with agreement, it begins with awareness. The moment we recognize that our perception is filtered, something powerful happens. Curiosity becomes possible. Instead of defending our position, we begin exploring it. Instead of assuming we already know why another person behaves a certain way, we become willing to ask questions. This shift may seem small, but biologically it changes everything. Curiosity activates different neural networks than judgment. It reduces threat responses within the nervous system and opens the door to meaningful connection. There is another dimension to this that deserves attention. Human beings possess a remarkable capacity for emotional resonance. We influence one another continuously, often without speaking a word. The emotional state of one family member can affect the entire household. Tension spreads, calm spreads, fear spreads, compassion spreads. Research increasingly shows that our nervous systems communicate through subtle cues, expressions, tone, posture, and countless signals operating below conscious awareness. In practical terms, this means that the energy we bring into a relationship matters more than we often realize. If someone carries unresolved anger into every interaction, others will sense it. If someone consistently embodies patience, others will respond differently. This does not mean one person is responsible for everyone else's emotions. It means we participate in a shared emotional environment. Families function less like collections of separate individuals and more like interconnected systems. Change in one part of the system influences the whole. When I reflect on the families that remain strong through adversity, I notice a common quality. They do not avoid conflict. They do not eliminate differences. Instead, they create enough emotional safety for differences to exist without destroying connection. That safety emerges when people learn to separate identity from belief. A person can disagree with an idea without rejecting the human being expressing it, yet reaching that level of maturity requires something many of us were never taught. It requires the ability to observe our own internal programming while it is happening, and in that moment we begin to discover that the walls of the silo were never as solid as they appeared, because the very awareness that allows us to see the silo is also the first step beyond it. And once that realization begins to take hold, an entirely new possibility starts to emerge within the family dynamic, as we slowly recognize that connection is not created by thinking alike, but by understanding what exists beneath the differences. This is where the conversation becomes even more important, because most people spend their lives trying to change the behavior of others while overlooking the deeper patterns that produce those behaviors in the first place. When families become trapped in cycles of conflict, the visible problem is rarely the actual problem. What we see on the surface is often the expression of something hidden underneath. The argument is visible. The emotional wound driving the argument is not. The silence is visible. The fear that created the silence is not. The criticism is visible. The insecurity beneath the criticism often remains completely unseen. I have noticed that many families unknowingly pass emotional patterns from one generation to the next. These patterns are not necessarily transmitted through words. In fact, they are often communicated through behavior, emotional responses, and unconscious habits. A child learns how to handle stress by observing adults. A child learns what love looks like by watching relationships unfold. A child learns whether vulnerability feels safe by experiencing the emotional atmosphere within the home. Long before conscious beliefs are formed, the nervous system is already collecting information about how the world works. Modern research continues revealing how deeply these experiences influence development. The brain adapts to repeated emotional environments. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. What begins as a coping mechanism can eventually become a personality trait. A child raised in an environment of constant criticism may become highly defensive as an adult. A child raised in emotional unpredictability may become hypervigilant, always anticipating potential conflict. These adaptations often make perfect sense when viewed in their original context. The challenge appears when the same patterns continue operating long after the original circumstances have disappeared. This is one reason many people find themselves repeating family dynamics they promised they would never repeat. They genuinely want different outcomes. Their conscious intentions are sincere, yet the subconscious mind continues executing programs established years earlier. Under stress, people often return to familiar emotional strategies because those strategies have become deeply embedded within the nervous system. The body remembers what the conscious mind has forgotten. Understanding this changes the way I view human behavior. Instead of asking, what is wrong with this person, I find it more useful to ask, what experience taught this person to respond this way? That single shift can transform judgment into compassion. It does not excuse harmful behavior, but it helps explain it. When explanation replaces assumption, communication becomes possible. When communication becomes possible, healing becomes possible. One of the most powerful insights emerging from both science and lived experience is that awareness itself can interrupt old patterns. The moment we become conscious of an automatic reaction, we create space between stimulus and response. That space may be small at first, perhaps only a few seconds, yet within those few seconds lies tremendous power. Instead of reacting from conditioning, we gain the opportunity to respond from intention. Imagine a family conversation that would normally escalate into an argument. One person feels triggered. The familiar emotional surge begins rising within the body. In the past, the reaction would have been immediate. Defensive words would appear almost automatically. But now there is awareness. The individual notices the sensation. They recognize the pattern. They pause. Nothing dramatic has happened externally, yet internally everything has changed. The old program has been interrupted. This process is not always comfortable. In fact, it can feel deeply uncomfortable because the nervous system prefers familiarity, even when familiarity creates suffering. Human beings often cling to predictable pain rather than embrace uncertain growth. The familiar argument feels safer than the unfamiliar vulnerability required for genuine connection. Yet growth always asks us to move beyond what feels automatic. I believe this is where emotional maturity truly begins. It is not the absence of strong emotions. It is the ability to remain conscious while experiencing them. Anger may still arise, fear may still arise, disappointment may still arise. The difference is that these emotions no longer become unquestioned commands. They become information rather than identity. We experience them without becoming consumed by them. Within families, this creates an entirely different environment. Conversations become less about winning and more about understanding. Listening becomes as important as speaking. People become curious about what another person is feeling rather than immediately preparing a counter-argument. The emotional climate begins to change because individuals are no longer relating solely through their conditioned reactions. Another aspect of the silo that deserves attention is the illusion of separateness. Modern culture often emphasizes individual achievement, personal success, and self-definition. While these values have benefits, they can also create unintended consequences. Families thrive through connection, cooperation, and mutual support. When identity becomes excessively individualistic, relationships can start feeling transactional. People begin evaluating one another based on performance rather than presence. Yet human biology tells a different story. We are deeply interconnected beings. Our brains evolved within social environments. Emotional connection influences physical health. Supportive relationships affect stress regulation, immune function, and overall well-being. Loneliness has measurable biological consequences. Connection has measurable biological benefits. The evidence increasingly suggests that relationships are not simply an optional enhancement to life. They are part of the foundation upon which human flourishing depends. This understanding invites a profound question. If connection is so essential, why do so many people struggle to maintain it? The answer may lie in the fact that genuine connection requires something the silo resists. It requires openness. It requires the willingness to be seen beyond our roles, beyond our defenses, beyond the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Many people fear this level of openness because vulnerability feels risky. If I reveal my authentic feelings, I might be rejected. If I admit my uncertainty, I might appear weak. If I express my pain, I might not be understood. And yet the paradox is that the very vulnerability we fear is often the bridge that creates connection. Families grow stronger, not when people become perfect, but when they become real. Authenticity allows others to respond to who we truly are rather than who we pretend to be. It creates trust because honesty signals safety. Over time, that safety becomes the environment where healing can occur. What fascinates me most is that transformation rarely begins with large dramatic events. More often, it begins with small moments repeated consistently. A pause before reacting, a sincere question, a willingness to listen, an honest conversation, a conscious breath during tension. These moments may appear insignificant individually, but collectively they reshape relationships. They gradually retrain the nervous system and establish new emotional patterns. As these new patterns take root, something remarkable begins to happen. Family members start seeing one another differently. The labels that once defined people begin losing their power. The difficult parent becomes a human being carrying unresolved pain. The distant child becomes a person searching for understanding. The critical partner becomes someone struggling to feel secure. Beneath the roles and behaviors, a deeper level of humanity starts becoming visible. And when that deeper humanity becomes visible, we start recognizing that many of the walls separating us were constructed from assumptions we never questioned, emotional habits we never examined, and stories we inherited without realizing it. The silo begins to weaken, not because someone forced it to collapse, but because awareness illuminated its structure. Once illuminated, we can finally see how much of our suffering was sustained by patterns operating outside conscious awareness, and that realization opens the door to a new understanding of what human connection is truly capable of becoming when we stop treating relationships as problems to solve and begin experiencing them as living systems to understand. This shift may sound subtle, yet it changes the entire foundation of how we interact with one another. A problem demands a solution. A living system requires awareness, adaptation, and care. Families are not machines composed of predictable parts. They are dynamic networks of thoughts, emotions, memories, expectations, and experiences constantly influencing one another in ways that are often invisible. The more deeply I explore human consciousness, the more I recognize that relationships function as mirrors, not perfect mirrors, but powerful ones. The people closest to us often reveal aspects of ourselves that we would otherwise never see. They expose our assumptions, our fears, our strengths, and our unresolved wounds. This is one reason family relationships can be both profoundly rewarding and intensely challenging. They bring us face to face with parts of ourselves that remain hidden in other areas of life. Consider how easily patience can disappear during a family disagreement. A person may remain calm and composed at work with friends or in public settings, yet become emotionally reactive at home. This is not necessarily because family members are more difficult. Often it is because family relationships reach deeper layers of the psyche. They activate emotional memories connected to belonging, acceptance, safety, and identity. The stakes feel higher because at a subconscious level, family often represents our earliest experience of connection. What fascinates me is that many people attempt to improve relationships by focusing exclusively on external behaviors. They search for better communication techniques, better conflict resolution strategies, or better ways to persuade others. While these tools can be valuable, lasting transformation usually requires something deeper. It requires understanding the emotional state from which behavior emerges. Words matter, but the consciousness behind those words matters even more. Two people can say the exact same sentence and create entirely different outcomes. One speaks from frustration and hidden resentment. The other speaks from compassion and genuine curiosity. The language may be similar, but the emotional signal is completely different. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to these signals. We detect sincerity, tension, judgment, and openness through countless subtle cues that operate beneath conscious awareness. This is where the mind-body connection becomes especially important. Every emotional state creates physiological changes within the body. Heart rhythms shift, hormones fluctuate, muscles tighten or relax, breathing patterns change. These biological responses influence not only how we feel internally, but also how we affect those around us. In many ways, we communicate long before we speak. When a family exists in a state of chronic stress, the entire emotional environment can become shaped by that stress. People become more reactive, less patient, and more likely to interpret neutral situations as threats. The nervous system moves into survival mode, and survival mode rarely produces meaningful connection. It prioritizes protection over understanding. It values certainty over curiosity. It encourages defense rather than openness. Yet the human system possesses an extraordinary capacity for change. Neuroscience continues demonstrating that the brain remains adaptable throughout life. Emotional habits can be reshaped. New neural pathways can form. Old patterns can weaken. This means that no matter how long a family has struggled, transformation remains possible. The past may influence the present, but it does not have to dictate the future. I believe one of the most overlooked aspects of healing is the role of emotional presence. In a world filled with distractions, many people are physically together but psychologically elsewhere. Conversations occur while attention is divided. Meals are shared without genuine engagement. Family members occupy the same space while living in separate mental worlds. Over time, this creates a subtle form of disconnection that can become surprisingly powerful. Presence is different. Presence means bringing our attention fully into the moment. It means listening not only to the words another person is speaking, but also to the emotions beneath those words. It means resisting the urge to immediately evaluate, fix, or judge what we hear. This kind of attention communicates something deeply meaningful. It tells another person that they matter. It tells them they are seen. Ancient traditions understood the importance of attention in human relationships. Modern science is now uncovering many of the biological mechanisms that help explain why it matters. When people feel genuinely heard, the nervous system often begins to relax, defensive barriers lower. Trust becomes easier to establish. Emotional regulation improves. The body responds to authentic connection in measurable ways. This understanding also changes how we think about conflict. Most people view conflict as evidence that something is wrong, but conflict itself is not necessarily the problem. In many cases, conflict simply reveals information that has not yet been understood. The real question is whether the conflict becomes a pathway to greater awareness or a trigger for deeper division. When people remain trapped within their silos, conflict usually reinforces separation. Each side becomes more convinced of its own perspective. Empathy decreases, defensive narratives strengthen. But when awareness enters the process, conflict can reveal hidden needs, unspoken fears, and deeper truths about the relationship. The same disagreement that once created distance can become an opportunity for understanding. This requires courage because understanding another person's perspective does not always feel comfortable. Sometimes it challenges our assumptions. Sometimes it reveals our blind spots. Sometimes it asks us to reconsider stories we have believed for years. Yet growth has always required the willingness to encounter uncertainty. I often think about how much human suffering originates from the need to be right. The desire for certainty can become so strong that it overshadows the desire for connection. People defend positions that no longer serve them simply because those positions have become part of their identity. The silo strengthens whenever belief becomes more important than relationship. Awareness creates another possibility. It allows us to hold beliefs without becoming imprisoned by them. It allows us to remain open to new information without feeling threatened by it. Most importantly, it allows us to recognize that another person's experience can be valid even when it differs from our own. This realization transforms the emotional atmosphere of a family. Instead of competing realities, there is space for multiple perspectives to coexist. Instead of demanding agreement, people seek understanding. Instead of viewing differences as threats, they begin seeing them as opportunities to expand awareness. The deeper I examine this process, the more I become convinced that healing is not primarily about changing others. It begins with changing the quality of consciousness we bring into our relationships. Every moment of awareness interrupts an unconscious pattern. Every act of compassion weakens the influence of fear. Every genuine effort to understand another person expands the possibility of connection. And as these small shifts accumulate over time, something remarkable begins unfolding. Families start moving beyond the limitations of the silo. The invisible walls that once seemed permanent begin losing their influence. New conversations become possible. New experiences emerge. New patterns take root. Gradually, people discover that beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the inherited fears, beneath the emotional habits accumulated over years, there exists a deeper capacity for connection that has been present all along, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be cultivated, and waiting to reveal what becomes possible when human beings remember that the strongest relationships are not built through control, agreement, or perfection, but through the conscious choice to remain connected, even as life continuously challenges us to forget that truth. And perhaps this is where one of the greatest misunderstandings about family begins to dissolve. Many people believe that connection is something we either have or do not have. They think strong families are simply fortunate, blessed with compatibility, while struggling families are somehow missing an essential ingredient. Yet when I look closely at the evidence of human experience, I see something very different. Connection is not a fixed condition. It is an ongoing practice. It is something that must be renewed again and again through awareness, intention, and choice. Every day presents opportunities, either to strengthen connection or weaken it. The challenge is that these opportunities rarely appear dramatic. They are hidden within ordinary moments. They exist in the way we greet one another, the way we respond to frustration, the way we handle disappointment, and the way we communicate when emotions become intense. Small moments seem insignificant while they are happening, yet they accumulate over time and gradually shape the emotional culture of a family. Culture is an interesting word because most people associate it with societies, organizations, or nations, yet every family develops its own culture as well. There are unspoken rules, there are emotional expectations, there are patterns that determine what is acceptable to express and what remains hidden. Some families create environments where emotions can be discussed openly. Others unintentionally encourage suppression. Some families foster curiosity and understanding. Others reinforce judgment and defensiveness. The remarkable thing is that much of this culture develops unconsciously. Family members participate in it without fully recognizing it. Children absorb it naturally because they have no alternative reference point. What feels normal within one household may feel completely unfamiliar within another. Over time, these emotional environments become powerful forces that influence how individuals relate not only to family members, but also to friends, partners, colleagues, and eventually their own children. This is why self-awareness has consequences far beyond the individual. When one person becomes conscious of an inherited pattern and chooses a different response, the effect extends outward. A single decision can alter the trajectory of future interactions. It can influence relationships that have not even been formed yet. In this sense, awareness becomes more than a personal achievement. It becomes a contribution to future generations. Modern science increasingly supports the idea that experiences leave lasting biological impressions. Chronic stress, emotional safety, supportive relationships, and repeated emotional states all influence human development. While researchers continue exploring the precise mechanisms involved, the broader message is clear. Human beings are shaped by the environments they inhabit. The emotional atmosphere within a family matters. It affects perception, behavior, resilience, and overall well-being. What I find especially hopeful is that the same principle works in a positive direction. Just as negative patterns can become reinforced through repetition, positive patterns can be strengthened as well. Compassion becomes easier when practiced regularly. Patience grows through repeated use. Trust develops through consistent experiences of reliability and care. The nervous system learns safety in much the same way it learns fear. Through repetition, what was once unfamiliar becomes natural. This understanding invites us to rethink what strength truly means. Many people associate strength with emotional control, independence, or the ability to endure hardship without vulnerability. Yet some of the strongest individuals I have encountered possess a different quality. They are willing to remain open even when openness feels uncomfortable. They are willing to listen when listening challenges their assumptions. They are willing to acknowledge mistakes without seeing those mistakes as threats to their identity. This kind of strength creates stability within relationships because it reduces the need for constant self-protection. When people are not continuously defending themselves, they become more capable of genuine engagement. Conversations become less about preserving ego and more about discovering truth. The emotional energy previously consumed by defensiveness becomes available for understanding, creativity, and connection. One of the most important lessons I have learned is that understanding does not require agreement. This distinction can transform family dynamics. Too often, people assume that acknowledging another person's experience means endorsing their perspective. As a result, they resist understanding because they fear it will compromise their own position. Yet understanding simply means recognizing that another person's experience feels real to them. It means seeing the emotional logic behind their perspective, even if we ultimately arrive at different conclusions. When families learn this distinction, conversations change dramatically. People stop fighting for validation and begin exploring one another's experiences. The goal shifts from winning to learning. Curiosity replaces certainty. Compassion becomes possible because understanding no longer feels like surrender. There is also something profound that happens when individuals begin taking responsibility for their own emotional state. This does not mean ignoring external circumstances or pretending that difficult situations do not exist. Rather, it means recognizing that while we cannot always control events, we can develop greater awareness of how we respond to them. This awareness interrupts the tendency to place all responsibility for our emotional experience on other people. Within families, this shift can be transformative. Instead of waiting for someone else to change first, individuals begin examining their own patterns. They become curious about their triggers, their assumptions, and the stories they tell themselves during moments of conflict. This process is not always comfortable because it requires honesty, yet it creates a level of freedom that blame can never provide. The silo begins to dissolve whenever responsibility and awareness replace unconscious reaction. The walls weaken because they are no longer being reinforced. Old narratives lose their authority. Automatic judgments become easier to question. Gradually, people start seeing one another with fresh eyes. I often imagine what would happen if more families approached relationships as opportunities for growth, rather than arenas of judgment. Imagine the difference if disagreements were viewed as chances to understand hidden perspectives. Imagine the impact if emotional reactions became invitations for self-discovery rather than reasons for blame. Imagine households where curiosity was valued as highly as certainty, and where listening was considered just as important as speaking. Such environments would not eliminate challenges. Human beings will always encounter differences, misunderstandings, and moments of tension. Diversity of thought is a natural part of life. The goal is not to remove complexity. The goal is to develop the awareness necessary to navigate complexity without sacrificing connection. This is where consciousness becomes practical rather than theoretical. It is not merely an abstract concept discussed in books or lectures. It reveals itself in everyday interactions. It appears in the pause before a reaction. It appears in the willingness to ask one more question rather than making one more assumption. It appears in the decision to remain present when it would be easier to withdraw. Over time, these choices create a different reality, not because circumstances become perfect, but because perception changes. People begin seeing possibilities where they once saw obstacles. They begin recognizing common humanity beneath apparent differences. They discover that connection is less dependent on external conditions than they previously believed. And as this realization deepens, a fascinating insight starts to emerge. The silo was never merely a family issue. It was a reflection of a larger pattern operating throughout human experience. The same mechanisms that separate family members often separate communities, generations, workplaces, and entire societies. The same unconscious habits that create distance at home can shape the way we engage with the broader world. Which means that when a family learns to move beyond the silo, it is participating in something much larger than personal healing. It is demonstrating a possibility that extends far beyond the walls of a single household, pointing toward a future where human beings begin to recognize that the quality of our relationships may ultimately depend on the quality of awareness we bring to every moment of our lives. And once we begin to understand how deeply that awareness influences everything we think, feel, and create, we are led to an even deeper question about what human consciousness itself may truly be. And that question invites us into territory that most people rarely explore. We spend enormous amounts of time studying the external world, learning how systems function, how technology evolves, and how societies change. Yet many of us spend far less time examining the very lens through which all experience is perceived. We analyze the world around us while overlooking the consciousness that interprets it. In the context of family relationships, this oversight can have profound consequences because the quality of our awareness shapes every interaction we have. When I observe human behavior, I am often reminded that people do not simply experience life, they experience their interpretation of life. Two individuals may encounter the same conversation and walk away with entirely different emotional conclusions. One feels appreciated, the other feels dismissed. One perceives concern, the other perceives criticism. The event itself may be identical, yet the internal experience differs dramatically because each person brings a unique history, emotional conditioning, and set of beliefs into the moment. This realization changes the way I think about conflict. If people are responding not only to present circumstances, but also to layers of accumulated experience, then understanding becomes far more important than judgment. Many family disagreements persist because individuals remain focused on the surface level issue while deeper emotional dynamics remain invisible. They debate facts when the real challenge involves feelings. They argue over details while underlying needs go unrecognized. One person may be seeking respect, another may be seeking reassurance, a third may be seeking a sense of belonging, yet instead of expressing those needs directly, they emerge indirectly through frustration, withdrawal, criticism, or defensiveness. Family members respond to the behavior they can see without fully understanding the emotional reality that produced it. This is where awareness becomes transformative. Awareness allows us to look beyond appearances. It helps us recognize that behavior often communicates information that words never express. The angry response may conceal fear. The controlling behavior may conceal uncertainty. The emotional distance may conceal disappointment or pain. When we learn to see beneath the surface, new possibilities emerge. Of course, this requires patience because human beings are complex. We are influenced by conscious thoughts and unconscious patterns simultaneously. We carry memories that continue shaping our perceptions long after the original events have passed. We often react to present situations through the emotional lens of experiences that occurred years earlier. Without awareness, these influences remain hidden. With awareness, they become visible. Modern neuroscience offers fascinating insights into this process. The brain constantly uses past experiences to predict future outcomes. It searches for familiar patterns and attempts to prepare us for what it expects will happen next. This ability serves an important purpose. It helps us navigate the world efficiently, yet it also creates limitations. When expectations become too rigid, they can distort perception. Imagine someone who has experienced repeated disappointment within relationships. Over time, the brain may begin expecting disappointment even in situations where no threat exists. Neutral interactions become interpreted through a defensive filter. Positive intentions are questioned. Opportunities for connection are overlooked because the nervous system is preparing for pain rather than possibility. Families often become trapped in these cycles without realizing it. People stop responding to who others are in the present and begin responding to who they expect them to be based on the past. A parent anticipates resistance from a child before the conversation even begins. A partner expects criticism before a word is spoken. A sibling assumes misunderstanding before attempting communication. Expectations quietly shape interactions, often creating the very outcomes people hope to avoid. What I find remarkable is that awareness has the power to interrupt this process. The moment we recognize an expectation operating within us, we gain the ability to question it. Instead of assuming our interpretation is accurate, we become curious about other possibilities. Instead of reacting automatically, we create space for reflection. This space is incredibly important because transformation rarely occurs in the midst of unconscious reaction. It occurs when awareness becomes strong enough to observe the reaction without immediately obeying it. In that moment, we begin shifting from conditioned behavior to conscious choice. Many people assume that conscious choice should feel effortless. In reality, it often feels challenging because it requires moving beyond familiar emotional habits. The nervous system prefers what it knows. Even unhealthy patterns can feel comfortable simply because they are predictable. Growth asks us to tolerate uncertainty long enough for something new to emerge. I believe this explains why meaningful change often occurs gradually rather than instantly. Human beings are not machines that can be reprogrammed with a single decision. We learn through repetition. We develop new patterns through practice. Just as emotional habits were formed over time, they are transformed over time as well. Within families, this means that healing is often built through consistent small actions rather than dramatic breakthroughs. A single conversation may not resolve years of misunderstanding, yet each sincere effort to listen contributes to a new pattern. Each moment of patience strengthens a different emotional pathway. Each act of compassion weakens the influence of old conditioning. Over months and years, these small shifts accumulate. Relationships begin changing, not because one major event occurred, but because countless minor choices gradually altered the emotional environment. Trust deepens, communication improves, defensive patterns lose strength. Family members become more capable of seeing one another clearly. This process also reveals something important about human potential. We are far more adaptable than we often believe. Many people define themselves by their current patterns, assuming those patterns represent permanent aspects of identity. They say, "This is just how I am." Yet both scientific evidence and lived experience suggest otherwise. Human beings possess extraordinary capacity for growth. The qualities we admire most, compassion, patience, resilience, emotional intelligence, are not fixed traits reserved for a select few. They are capacities that can be cultivated. Like any skill, they strengthen through intentional practice. The brain changes, the nervous system adapts, new possibilities emerge. When families understand this principle, they stop viewing one another through rigid labels. Instead of seeing someone as permanently difficult, distant, or stubborn, they begin recognizing that every person is a process rather than a finished product. Everyone is evolving. Everyone is carrying experiences that continue shaping their behavior. Everyone possesses the potential for growth. This perspective creates hope because it shifts attention away from limitation and toward possibility. It encourages patience during periods of struggle. It reminds us that today's challenges do not necessarily determine tomorrow's outcomes. Most importantly, it helps us see one another through the lens of potential rather than judgment. The deeper I reflect on these ideas, the more I recognize that consciousness is not merely something we possess. It is something we participate in. It influences the way we perceive reality, relate to others, and construct meaning from experience. Every thought, every emotion, and every belief contributes to the world we inhabit internally and the relationships we create externally. When families become aware of this dynamic, they begin understanding that connection is not only about communication techniques or conflict resolution strategies, it is about the quality of awareness each person brings into the relationship. It is about recognizing how thoughts influence emotions, how emotions influence behavior, and how behavior influences the collective environment shared by everyone involved. And as that recognition deepens, another realization naturally follows. If consciousness shapes relationships and relationships shape human experience, then perhaps the future of our families depends less on changing external circumstances and more on understanding the inner forces that guide perception itself. Because once we begin exploring the relationship between awareness, emotion, biology, and connection, we find ourselves approaching one of the most fascinating discoveries available to any human being, the possibility that the patterns we see in our families may actually reveal something much larger about the hidden architecture of consciousness, and understanding that architecture may fundamentally change the way we understand not only relationships, but the nature of human experience itself. And this is where the conversation becomes especially meaningful, because once we begin examining the hidden architecture of consciousness, we discover that many of the struggles we experience in families are not isolated events. They are expressions of deeper patterns that exist within human nature itself. The family simply becomes the place where those patterns are easiest to observe. Think about how often people search for external explanations when relationships begin to weaken. They point to changing times, economic pressures, technology, personality differences, or generational gaps. While all of these factors can influence relationships, they do not fully explain why two families can experience similar circumstances and produce completely different outcomes. The difference often lies in how individuals process experience internally. Every event passes through the filter of perception. That filter is shaped by beliefs, emotional memories, expectations, and unconscious assumptions. In many ways, consciousness functions like a lens. When the lens is clear, we perceive reality with greater accuracy. When the lens is distorted by fear, resentment, or unresolved emotional patterns, our interpretation becomes distorted as well. The challenge is that most people are aware of what they see, but not of the lens through which they are seeing it. This creates one of the most powerful illusions in human experience. We assume that our perspective is objective. We assume that the way we interpret a situation is the way it actually is. Yet consciousness research, psychology, and everyday experience repeatedly suggest otherwise. Our perception is always influenced by internal factors that operate below conscious awareness. Within families, this often leads to cycles of misunderstanding. One person believes they are offering guidance, another experiences criticism. One believes they are creating boundaries, another experiences rejection. One believes they are expressing concern, another experiences control. Neither person is necessarily trying to create conflict. The conflict emerges because different internal realities are interacting with one another. What fascinates me is that awareness can reveal these hidden dynamics. The moment we become curious about our own perceptions, we begin seeing possibilities that were previously invisible. Instead of asking, why is this person behaving this way? We begin asking, what am I bringing into this interaction that may be influencing what I see? That question has extraordinary power because it shifts attention inward without abandoning responsibility outward. It encourages self-examination rather than blame. And self-examination is one of the most transformative capacities human beings possess. The ancient wisdom traditions understood this principle deeply. Long before modern neuroscience existed, observers of human behavior recognized that lasting change begins within. They understood that external circumstances often mirror internal conditions. Modern science approaches the idea through different language, yet many conclusions are surprisingly similar. Perception influences behavior, beliefs influence biology, emotional states influence decision-making, internal patterns affect external outcomes. These insights become especially important when we consider the emotional climate of a family. Most people think communication occurs primarily through words, yet words represent only a small portion of what family members exchange with one another. Emotional states are constantly being communicated through tone, posture, facial expression, energy level, attention, and countless subtle signals. A child entering a room often senses tension before anyone speaks. A partner frequently detects emotional distance without hearing a single sentence. Family members become experts at reading one another because they share repeated experiences over long periods of time. This means that the emotional environment of a household carries enormous influence. If fear dominates the environment, family members adapt to fear. If criticism dominates the environment, family members adapt to criticism. If understanding dominates the environment, family members adapt to understanding. The nervous system learns from repetition. Over time, repeated emotional experiences become expectations. Expectations become habits. Habits become patterns. Patterns become identity. And eventually, people forget that these patterns were learned in the first place. They begin believing that the pattern is simply who they are. This is where awareness becomes revolutionary. The moment we recognize that a pattern was learned, we also recognize that it can be changed. That realization opens a door that many people never knew existed. Instead of feeling trapped by inherited behaviors, individuals begin exploring new possibilities. Instead of repeating familiar reactions automatically, they become capable of creating different responses. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Entire family systems can begin changing when even one person becomes conscious of a pattern that previously operated unconsciously. Why? Because relationships are interconnected. Every interaction influences future interactions. Every response shapes the emotional field in which future conversations occur. A different response creates a different outcome. A different outcome creates a different expectation. A different expectation creates a different pattern. And over time, a different pattern creates a different reality. When I look at families that successfully move beyond long-standing conflict, I often notice that transformation begins not with grand solutions, but with subtle shifts in awareness. Someone decides to listen more carefully. Someone becomes willing to admit uncertainty. Someone chooses curiosity instead of assumption. Someone pauses before reacting. These moments appear small, yet their impact can be profound because they interrupt automatic cycles. The old pattern expects one outcome. Awareness introduces another. This is why consciousness matters so deeply in human relationships. Consciousness determines how we interpret events. Interpretation influences emotional responses. Emotional responses influence behavior. Behavior shapes relationships. Relationships shape the quality of our lives. Seen from this perspective, the breakdown of families is not merely a social issue. It is also a consciousness issue. The silo we have been exploring is not simply external. It exists within perception itself. It is built from assumptions we rarely question, emotional habits we rarely examine, and beliefs we often mistake for reality. The walls of the silo are strengthened every time we assume we already understand another person's experience. They weaken every time curiosity replaces certainty. They weaken every time empathy replaces judgment. They weaken every time awareness becomes stronger than automatic reaction. And perhaps this is why some of the most meaningful transformations occur when people stop trying to win and start trying to understand. Understanding does not require agreement. It requires presence. It requires attention. It requires the willingness to recognize that another person's inner world may be as complex, valid, and emotionally real as our own. That recognition changes everything, because once we truly understand that every family member is navigating their own fears, hopes, memories, beliefs, and emotional conditioning, it becomes much harder to reduce them to a label or a role. We begin seeing the human being beneath the behavior. the person beneath the pattern, the consciousness beneath the conditioning. And as that perspective expands, something remarkable starts to happen. Compassion becomes less of an effort and more of a natural response. Patience grows. Defensiveness softens. Connection deepens, not because differences disappear, but because awareness becomes large enough to hold those differences without allowing them to destroy the relationship. The family begins functioning less like a collection of isolated individuals and more like a living system capable of growth. A system in which every act of awareness contributes to the well-being of the whole. A system in which healing spreads through example. A system in which one person's transformation quietly influences everyone around them. And as we continue exploring what this means, we arrive at an even deeper realization, one that challenges many of the assumptions modern culture has taught us about identity, separation, and human connection. Because when we look closely at the science of relationships, the biology of emotion, and the nature of consciousness itself, we begin encountering evidence that suggests human beings may be connected in ways far more profound than we have been conditioned to believe, and understanding that possibility may completely reshape how we view not only our families, but our place within the larger human story. And if that possibility is true, then the way we think about separation may need to change entirely. For generations, many people have been taught to view themselves as independent units moving through life alone, connected to others only through circumstance, obligation, or shared interests. Yet when I examine both the science of human behavior and the lived reality of relationships, I see a very different picture emerging. Human beings are profoundly interconnected. We affect one another continuously, often in ways we barely recognize. This interconnection becomes most visible within families because families represent our closest and most consistent relationships. The emotional state of one person can influence an entire household. One individual's anxiety can quietly spread through conversations, routines, and interactions. Likewise, one person's calm presence can bring stability to situations that might otherwise become chaotic. Most people have experienced this phenomenon without consciously thinking about it. Someone enters a room carrying frustration, and the atmosphere changes. Another person enters carrying warmth and genuine presence, and the environment shifts in a completely different direction. No formal communication is necessary. The human nervous system is constantly exchanging information through channels that extend beyond spoken language. What this means is that the quality of consciousness we cultivate within ourselves does not remain isolated within us. It influences every relationship we touch. This realization carries tremendous responsibility, but it also carries tremendous hope. Why? Because it means that meaningful change does not always require changing everyone around us. Sometimes it begins with changing the state from which we interact with the world. When people hear this idea, they occasionally misunderstand it. They assume it means ignoring difficult circumstances or pretending that unhealthy behavior does not exist. That is not what I mean at all. Awareness does not require denial. In fact, awareness requires greater honesty than denial ever could. The difference is that awareness allows us to respond consciously rather than react automatically. It allows us to recognize challenges without becoming consumed by them. It allows us to see behavior clearly while still remembering the humanity behind the behavior. This balance is one of the most difficult skills to develop because the mind naturally gravitates toward extremes. We often want simple categories, right or wrong, good or bad, friend or enemy. Yet real human beings rarely fit neatly into such categories. A family member may be loving in one moment and difficult in another. A parent may carry deep wisdom while also carrying unresolved wounds. A child may be struggling outwardly while possessing remarkable inner strength. Human beings are complex, and when we forget that complexity, relationships suffer. The silo thrives on oversimplification. It encourages us to reduce people to stories. It tells us that we already know who someone is. It convinces us that past experiences fully define present possibilities. But awareness challenges those assumptions. Awareness reminds us that every person contains more depth than our current perception can fully comprehend. This becomes especially important when considering how families evolve over time. One of the most common mistakes people make is assuming that others remain exactly as they were years ago. A parent continues relating to an adult child as if they were still a teenager. A sibling continues responding to another sibling based on childhood experiences. Partners continue reacting to old versions of one another that no longer exist. The result is a strange kind of disconnection. People are interacting with memories rather than realities. They are relating to outdated perceptions rather than present experiences. In many cases, family conflict persists because individuals fail to recognize how much growth has already occurred. They continue defending themselves against threats that no longer exist. They continue expecting behaviors that have already changed. They continue carrying emotional maps that no longer match the territory. This is why presence is so powerful. Presence allows us to meet people where they are rather than where they used to be. It allows us to observe without immediately filtering everything through the past. It creates space for new possibilities to emerge. And new possibilities are essential because growth requires flexibility. A rigid system cannot adapt. A rigid belief cannot learn. A rigid identity cannot evolve. Families remain healthy, not because they avoid change, but because they develop the capacity to grow with change. Every family encounters transitions. Children grow older. Roles shift. Circumstances change. Challenges emerge unexpectedly. No relationship remains static. The question is whether family members adapt consciously or resist the natural process of transformation. When resistance dominates, conflict often increases. People cling to old expectations. They attempt to preserve familiar dynamics long after those dynamics have stopped serving anyone. They fight change because change feels uncertain. Yet uncertainty is often where growth begins. In fact, some of the most important transformations occur when people become willing to release outdated versions of themselves. This can be surprisingly emotional. Many identities are built around stories accumulated over years or even decades. Someone may define themselves as the responsible one, the peacemaker, the caretaker, the rebel, the achiever, the misunderstood one. These identities often begin as adaptive responses to specific circumstances. Over time, however, they can become limitations. People continue performing roles that no longer reflect who they are becoming. Families continue relating to those roles because the roles feel familiar. The silo reinforces this process by convincing everyone that the role is the person. But the role is not the person. The story is not the person. The pattern is not the person. Beneath all of these layers exists something deeper. There is an awareness capable of observing the pattern. There is a consciousness capable of recognizing the story. And whatever can observe a pattern is not identical to the pattern itself. This insight has profound implications. It means that change is always possible. Not because circumstances magically improve, but because awareness creates freedom. The moment we recognize a pattern, we gain the ability to relate to it differently. The moment we become conscious of a belief, we gain the ability to question it. The moment we observe an emotional reaction, we gain the ability to choose our response. This is the foundation of transformation. And within families, transformation rarely occurs through force. People rarely grow because they were pressured into growth. More often, they grow because awareness gradually reveals a more expansive possibility. They begin seeing themselves differently. They begin seeing others differently. They begin recognizing that many of the walls separating them were constructed from fear, misunderstanding, and unconscious habits rather than objective reality. As this recognition deepens, something remarkable begins to emerge. Relationships become less about controlling outcomes and more about cultivating understanding. Communication becomes less about proving a point and more about discovering truth. Love becomes less dependent on agreement and more rooted in presence. The emotional atmosphere begins changing because people are no longer relating exclusively through old conditioning. They are relating through awareness, and awareness has a unique quality. It creates space. Space between thought and reaction. Space between emotion and behavior. Space between assumption and understanding. Within that space, entirely new possibilities become available. Possibilities that could never emerge from automatic patterns alone. The deeper I explore these ideas, the more convinced I become that the future of human relationships depends on our willingness to understand consciousness itself. Because every conflict, every misunderstanding, every moment of connection, and every act of compassion ultimately passes through the filter of awareness. And once we begin examining that filter with genuine curiosity, we discover that many of the answers we have been seeking in the external world may actually be pointing us inward toward a deeper understanding of who we are, how we perceive reality, and why the evolution of consciousness may be one of the most important frontiers of human development still waiting to be fully explored. And perhaps the reason this frontier remains so important is that every challenge we have discussed ultimately returns to a single question. How aware are we of the forces shaping our experience? Most people assume they are making decisions based purely on logic and conscious intention. Yet when we look closely at human behavior, we find that much of what drives us operates beneath conscious awareness. Habits, emotional memories, assumptions, and conditioned responses quietly influence perception long before rational thought enters the picture. This does not mean human beings lack free will. Rather, it suggests that freedom expands in direct proportion to awareness. The less aware we are of our internal patterns, the more likely we are to be governed by them. The more aware we become, the more capable we are of making conscious choices. Within families, this distinction can change everything. Consider how often people react to one another from habit rather than intention. A familiar comment triggers a familiar emotion. The familiar emotion produces a familiar response. The response creates a familiar outcome. The cycle repeats itself so many times that everyone involved begins expecting it. Eventually, the pattern feels inevitable. Yet inevitability is often an illusion created by repetition. What appears fixed may simply be unconscious. And what becomes conscious can often be transformed. This is one of the most encouraging discoveries emerging from both neuroscience and human experience. The brain is not static. The nervous system is not fixed. Emotional patterns are not permanent. Human beings possess an extraordinary capacity to learn, adapt, and evolve throughout life. The challenge is that growth usually requires something many people spend years avoiding: self-observation. Not judgment, not criticism, not self-condemnation. Simply observation, the ability to notice what is happening within us while it is happening. This sounds simple, but it is one of the most powerful skills a person can develop. When we observe our thoughts, we begin recognizing recurring mental patterns. When we observe our emotions, we begin identifying emotional triggers. When we observe our reactions, we begin understanding the mechanisms that drive behavior. Over time, awareness reveals connections that were previously invisible. We start noticing how certain beliefs generate specific emotions. We notice how specific emotions influence physical sensations. We notice how those sensations affect communication, decision-making, and relationships. The mind and body begin appearing less like separate systems and more like different expressions of the same process. This insight has profound implications for families because many conflicts are sustained by unconscious emotional cycles. A person feels rejected. The feeling creates defensiveness. Defensiveness creates distance. Distance reinforces feelings of rejection. The cycle repeats. Another person feels unappreciated. The feeling creates frustration. Frustration creates criticism. Criticism damages connection. The lack of connection reinforces feelings of being unappreciated. Again, the cycle repeats. Without awareness, these patterns can continue for years. People become trapped in emotional loops they do not fully understand. They focus on symptoms while overlooking causes. They attempt to change outcomes without examining the processes generating those outcomes. Awareness changes the equation. Once a pattern becomes visible, it can no longer operate with the same level of unconscious influence. The individual gains the opportunity to interrupt the cycle, perhaps not perfectly, perhaps not immediately, but gradually And gradual change is often more powerful than dramatic change because it becomes sustainable. I have found that many people underestimate the significance of small shifts. They imagine transformation as a sudden breakthrough that permanently changes everything overnight. Sometimes breakthroughs occur, but more often, transformation resembles a series of tiny adjustments repeated consistently over time. One conscious breath before responding, one moment of listening instead of interrupting, one decision to ask a question rather than make an assumption, one choice to remain present during discomfort instead of withdrawing from it. These moments appear insignificant in isolation, yet relationships are built from moments. Families are built from moments. Lives are built from moments. The cumulative effect of thousands of small choices often becomes more powerful than any single dramatic event. This is especially true when we consider emotional environments. Every family generates an emotional atmosphere. That atmosphere is not created by one person alone. It emerges from countless interactions occurring day after day. Trust is built one experience at a time. Safety is built one experience at a time. Understanding is built one experience at a time. Likewise, distance, resentment, and misunderstanding often develop through the accumulation of small experiences rather than one major incident. When people recognize this, they stop waiting for perfect conditions before investing in connection. They begin understanding that every interaction contributes to the larger system. Every conversation matters. Every act of attention matters. Every moment of compassion matters. Not because any single moment changes everything, but because repeated moments shape patterns, and patterns shape reality. This principle extends beyond individual families. The same dynamics influencing households influence communities, organizations, and societies. Human beings are pattern-forming creatures. We create habits collectively, just as we create them individually. We develop shared assumptions, shared emotional responses, shared narratives about who we are and how the world works. Sometimes these narratives support growth. Sometimes they limit it. The silo we have been exploring exists not only within families, but throughout human culture. Groups divide themselves into categories. People define themselves by differences. Assumptions harden into certainty. Certainty reduces curiosity. And when curiosity disappears, understanding becomes increasingly difficult. Yet the solution remains remarkably consistent across every level of human interaction. Awareness. Not awareness as an abstract idea, awareness as a lived practice. The willingness to observe before reacting. The willingness to question assumptions. The willingness to recognize that our current perspective may not represent the entire picture. This kind of awareness creates humility, and humility creates space for learning. The more deeply I reflect on consciousness, the more I appreciate the role of humility in human development. A mind convinced it already knows everything cannot grow. A person convinced they fully understand another human being stops paying attention. Growth requires openness. Relationships require openness. Understanding requires openness. Without openness, perception becomes rigid. With openness, perception remains alive. Families flourish when they preserve this openness despite inevitable differences. Not because everyone agrees, not because conflict disappears, but because connection remains more important than certainty. People remain willing to learn from one another. They remain willing to update old assumptions. They remain willing to see one another as evolving human beings rather than fixed identities. This perspective transforms the meaning of relationship itself. The family ceases to be merely a social structure. It becomes a living environment for growth, a place where awareness can deepen, a place where unconscious patterns can become visible, a place where compassion can be practiced, a place where human beings learn, often imperfectly, how to navigate the complexities of connection. And perhaps that is one of the most important insights hidden within the challenges families face today. The breakdowns are not merely signs of failure. Often, they are invitations to examine What has been overlooked? Invitations to become aware of patterns that have remained unconscious. Invitations to explore deeper dimensions of communication, emotion, biology, and consciousness. Because when we accept those invitations, something extraordinary begins to unfold. What once appeared to be a problem reveals itself as a doorway into greater self-understanding, greater compassion, greater emotional intelligence, and ultimately a deeper recognition that the evolution of human consciousness may not happen through isolated individuals alone, but through the countless relationships that challenge us, teach us, mirror us, and gradually awaken us to aspects of ourselves we could never discover in any other way. And that realization leads us toward an even more profound question about what becomes possible when an entire generation begins approaching relationships not as obstacles to personal freedom, but as catalysts for the expansion of awareness itself. Because the moment we begin viewing relationships as catalysts for the expansion of awareness, the entire meaning of family starts to shift. Instead of asking only what we can receive from our relationships, we begin asking what those relationships are revealing about us. Every interaction becomes a source of information. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to understand something previously hidden. Every moment of connection becomes evidence that human beings are capable of far more depth, resilience, and transformation than they often realize. This perspective does not eliminate pain. Families will still experience misunderstandings, disappointments, and periods of struggle. Human beings are imperfect, and every relationship reflects that reality. Yet awareness changes how we relate to those difficulties. Rather than seeing them solely as obstacles, we begin recognizing them as signals. They point toward areas where greater understanding is needed. They reveal emotional patterns seeking attention. They expose assumptions that may no longer serve us. One of the most fascinating aspects of consciousness is its tendency to operate in layers. What appears obvious on the surface often rests upon deeper influences. A disagreement about time, responsibility, or communication may seem straightforward. Yet beneath it may exist questions about belonging, trust, identity, or emotional safety. People frequently debate the visible issue while the invisible issue remains untouched. This is why some conflicts never seem to resolve. The conversation stays focused on symptoms rather than causes. Imagine a family repeatedly arguing about how often they spend time together. On the surface, the issue appears to be scheduling. Yet beneath the discussion, one person may be experiencing loneliness, another may be struggling with pressure and overwhelm. A third may fear losing connection as life changes. Until those deeper realities become visible, the conversation remains incomplete. Awareness allows us to move beneath the surface. It invites us to ask different questions. Not merely what is happening, but also, what does this experience mean to each person involved? Meaning matters because human beings do not respond only to events. We respond to the meaning we assign to those events. Two people can hear the same sentence and experience entirely different emotional reactions because they interpret its meaning differently. This insight helps explain why communication can be so challenging. Words pass through personal histories before they are understood. They pass through expectations. They pass through emotional memories. They pass through beliefs about self-worth, trust, and belonging. By the time a message is received, it may carry a very different meaning than the one originally intended. Families often underestimate the power of this process. They assume communication failed because someone was unwilling to listen. Sometimes that is true. But often communication fails because people are listening through different emotional filters. The silo exists within those filters. It shapes perception without announcing its presence. It influences interpretation while remaining largely invisible. Yet, once we become aware of it, something important changes. We stop assuming our interpretation is the only possible interpretation. We become curious. And curiosity is one of the most transformative forces available to human consciousness. Curiosity softens certainty. It creates room for exploration. It allows us to approach another person's experience without immediately judging it. This quality becomes increasingly valuable in a world that often rewards certainty over understanding. Many social systems encourage people to defend positions rather than investigate them, to react quickly rather than reflect deeply, to choose sides rather than explore complexity. Families can easily absorb these habits. Conversations become debates. Differences become threats. Listening becomes preparation for a counter-argument. Over time, connection weakens because genuine understanding is replaced by competition. Yet, awareness offers another path, a path where understanding becomes more important than winning, a path where presence becomes more important than performance, a path where human beings remember that relationships are not intellectual contests, but living experiences. When families move in this direction, remarkable shifts begin occurring. People become less interested in proving themselves right. They become more interested in discovering what is true. And truth often reveals itself differently than expected. Sometimes truth reveals that both perspectives contain valid insights. Sometimes it reveals that fear has been disguising itself as certainty. Sometimes it reveals that what appeared to be conflict was actually a longing for connection expressed in an unskillful way. These realizations are not always comfortable. They require humility. They require patience. They require the willingness to question stories we may have repeated for years. Yet this willingness is precisely what allows growth to occur. Growth depends on flexibility. A rigid system cannot adapt to new information. A rigid identity cannot evolve beyond its current limitations. Consciousness expands through openness. The more open we become to examining our own assumptions, the more freedom we experience. This freedom has profound effects on relationships. When individuals are no longer controlled by unconscious patterns, they respond differently. They listen differently. They communicate differently. They perceive differently. And because relationships are systems of interaction, even small changes can produce significant effects over time. One person's awareness influences the entire system. One person's patience alters the emotional atmosphere. One person's commitment to understanding creates opportunities that did not previously exist. This is why transformation within families often begins with individuals rather than groups. Someone becomes aware, someone chooses a different response, someone interrupts a familiar cycle. The effect may appear small initially, but every pattern must begin somewhere. Every shift in culture begins with a shift in behavior. Every shift in behavior begins with a shift in awareness. What I find most encouraging is that awareness is available in every moment. It does not require perfect circumstances. It does not depend upon external validation. It begins wherever we are in the next conversation. The next reaction, the next opportunity to listen, the next opportunity to pause. The next opportunity to choose understanding over assumption. This makes consciousness deeply practical. It is not an abstract concept reserved for philosophical discussion. It influences daily life continuously. It affects the way we interpret events, respond to emotions, and engage with the people around us. The more conscious we become, the more intentional our relationships become. And intentional relationships create environments where growth can flourish. Such environments are especially important because human beings learn through experience. Children learn from the emotional atmosphere surrounding them. Adults continue learning from the relationships they participate in. Families become living classrooms where patterns of awareness, empathy, resilience, and communication are either strengthened or weakened through repetition. When awareness is present, those patterns begin evolving in healthier directions. Trust grows. Emotional safety grows. Understanding grows. Not because life becomes easier, but because people become more capable of navigating complexity together. And perhaps this is the deeper invitation hidden beneath the challenges families face today. The invitation is not simply to repair relationships. It is to understand the nature of consciousness itself, to recognize how perception shapes reality, how beliefs shape behavior, how emotions shape biology, how awareness shapes every experience we have. Because once we begin seeing these connections clearly, we realize that family is about far more than shared history or shared genetics. It becomes a powerful arena in which human consciousness encounters itself, learns about itself, and gradually evolves through the mirror of relationship. And when enough individuals begin engaging in that process consciously, the implications extend far beyond any single household, raising a profound possibility that the future of human connection may depend not primarily on technological advancement or social change, but on our collective willingness to understand the extraordinary power of awareness and the role it plays in shaping the reality we experience together. And if awareness truly plays such a central role in shaping our shared reality, then one of the most important questions we can ask is this: what prevents us from becoming aware in the first place? Why do so many people remain trapped in patterns they genuinely want to change? Why do families continue repeating cycles that create pain even when everyone involved desires something better? The answer, at least in part, may be found in the nature of familiarity. Human beings are deeply influenced by what feels familiar. The nervous system is designed to recognize patterns and create predictability. This ability helps us navigate the world efficiently, but it also creates a paradox. Sometimes we become attached not to what is healthy, but to what is known. A familiar pattern can feel safe even when it causes suffering. An unfamiliar possibility can feel threatening even when it offers growth. This is one reason transformation often feels uncomfortable. Growth asks us to move beyond emotional territories we understand into territories we do not. It asks us to release identities that once protected us. It asks us to question assumptions that have shaped our perception for years. Within families, this process can be particularly challenging because relationships often reinforce familiar roles. The responsible one continues being responsible. The caretaker continues taking care of everyone else. The peacemaker continues avoiding conflict. The achiever continues seeking approval through performance. The rebel continues resisting expectations. Over time, these roles become deeply embedded within family dynamics. Everyone begins expecting them, everyone begins responding to them, and eventually individuals may forget that the role is only one aspect of who they are. This is where the silo becomes especially powerful. The silo does not merely separate people from one another, it also separates people from aspects of themselves. It encourages narrow definitions of identity. It reduces complexity into predictable categories. It tells us who we are supposed to be and who others are supposed to be. Yet human consciousness is far more expansive than any role can capture. Every person contains possibilities that extend beyond their current patterns. Every person possesses qualities that may remain dormant until the right conditions allow them to emerge. Families sometimes fail to recognize this because familiarity creates blindness. When we think we already know someone completely, we stop discovering them. When we think we already know ourselves completely, we stop growing. Awareness restores the capacity for discovery. It reminds us that human beings are dynamic processes rather than fixed identities. We are constantly changing, learning, adapting, evolving. The challenge is that evolution requires attention. Without attention, growth tends to be guided by unconscious forces. With attention, growth becomes intentional. This distinction may be one of the most important insights we can bring into family life. Most people spend significant energy trying to manage external circumstances. They try to control outcomes, control behavior, control situations. Yet many of the most powerful influences on relationships exist internally. Perception influences communication. Beliefs influence expectations. Emotions influence decisions. Awareness influences all of them. The more conscious we become of these influences, the more effectively we can navigate them. This is why emotional intelligence is so valuable. At its core, emotional intelligence is not simply the ability to identify feelings. It is the ability to understand how emotions interact with thoughts, perceptions, behaviors, and relationships. It is the ability to remain aware while emotions are occurring. Many people assume emotions are obstacles to clear thinking. In reality, emotions are information. The challenge arises when information becomes identity, when anger becomes I am angry rather than I am experiencing anger, when fear becomes I am afraid rather than I am noticing fear. This subtle difference creates tremendous freedom. The observer and the experience are not identical. Awareness allows us to recognize that distinction. And once we recognize it, emotions become easier to navigate. They no longer control the entire field of perception. They become part of the experience rather than the entirety of the experience. Families benefit enormously when individuals develop this capacity. Conversations become less reactive. Conflicts become less destructive. People become more capable of hearing one another because they are not completely overwhelmed by their own emotional responses. The nervous system begins operating from a different state. Instead of constantly scanning for threats, it becomes more open to connection. This openness is essential because connection requires vulnerability. Not vulnerability in the sense of weakness, vulnerability in the sense of authenticity. The willingness to be seen honestly, the willingness to express uncertainty, the willingness to admit hurt, fear, confusion, or need. Many families struggle because vulnerability has become associated with danger. People learn to protect themselves by hiding what they truly feel. They communicate indirectly. They suppress emotions. They avoid difficult conversations. In the short term, these strategies may reduce discomfort. In the long term, they often create distance. Distance grows when authenticity disappears. Connection deepens when authenticity returns. This is why trust is such a foundational element of healthy relationships. Trust creates the conditions necessary for honesty. Honesty creates the conditions necessary for understanding. Understanding creates the conditions necessary for growth. Without trust, communication becomes filtered through self-protection. With trust, communication becomes an opportunity for genuine connection. What fascinates me is that trust itself develops through repeated experiences. Just as fear can be learned, trust can be learned. Just as defensiveness can become habitual, openness can become habitual. The nervous system adapts to whatever it experiences repeatedly. This means families are constantly teaching one another how to relate. Every interaction becomes a lesson. Every response becomes information. Every moment contributes to the emotional environment being created. When awareness enters this process, people begin taking greater responsibility for the environments they help create. They recognize that their presence matters. Their attention matters. Their emotional state matters, not because they control everyone else's experience, but because they contribute to the shared reality of the relationship. This understanding transforms the way we view influence. Influence is no longer about persuasion or control. It becomes about embodiment. The qualities we cultivate within ourselves naturally affect those around us. Patience influences relationships. Compassion influences relationships. Presence influences relationships. Awareness influences relationships. The more deeply these qualities become integrated into daily life, the more powerfully they shape the systems we inhabit. And because families are among the most influential systems in human development, the effects can extend far beyond a single generation. Children learn not only from what adults say, but from how adults live. They observe emotional regulation, conflict resolution, empathy, listening, self-awareness. These lessons become part of the foundation upon which future relationships are built, which means that every act of awareness carries significance beyond the present moment. Every conscious choice contributes to a larger story, a story that extends through families, communities, and ultimately society itself. And when viewed from that perspective, the work of becoming more aware is no longer merely personal. It becomes relational, it becomes generational, it becomes part of a broader evolution in how human beings understand themselves and one another. Because as awareness expands, the boundaries of the silo continue dissolving, revealing connections that were always present but rarely recognized, and leading us toward a deeper understanding that perhaps the greatest transformation available to humanity is not technological, political, or economic, but the gradual awakening of consciousness to its own extraordinary capacity for connection, creativity, healing, and growth
When we look deeply at why families struggle, we begin to notice something that is often missed in everyday conversation. Most people assume conflict is caused by external events: money, communication styles, personality differences, or life stress. But when I step back and observe these patterns more carefully, I see that the real story is happening underneath the surface. What we call family problems are often expressions of something much deeper: the way human consciousness filters experience. Let me explain this in simple terms. Imagine that your mind is like a lens through which you see the world. This lens is shaped by your past experiences, your emotional memories, and your beliefs about yourself and others. Now, here's the important part: you are not seeing reality directly, you are seeing reality through that lens. So, when two people in the same family experience the same situation, they are not actually experiencing the same reality internally. One person may feel criticized, while the other believes they are simply offering help. One may feel ignored, while the other believes they are giving space. The external event is the same, but the internal interpretation is completely different. This is the foundation of what I call the silo effect. Each person becomes locked inside their own interpretation of reality, unaware that others are living inside equally valid but different internal worlds. Now, science gives us a powerful way to understand why this happens. The human brain does not record reality like a camera. Instead, it predicts reality based on past experiences. It constantly tries to save energy by saying, I've seen something similar before, so I already know what this means. This process is helpful for survival, but it also creates distortion. For example, if someone grew up in an environment where they were often criticized, their brain may begin to interpret neutral feedback as criticism even when none is intended. This is not imagination, it is a learned neural pattern. The brain is doing its job, but it is using old data to interpret new experiences. Over time, these interpretations become emotional habits. And emotional habits shape relationships. This is why families often feel stuck in repeating cycles. It is not because people want conflict, it is because their nervous systems are reacting automatically based on old emotional learning. Now, here is where things become very important. Between stimulus and reaction, there is a small space. In that space lies awareness. Most people live without noticing that space. They react immediately because the nervous system has already decided what something means before conscious thought arrives. But when awareness enters the process, something powerful happens. The cycle can be interrupted. Let me give a simple example. Imagine a father says something to his child that the child interprets as judgment. In the past, the child might immediately respond with anger or withdrawal. But if the child becomes aware of their internal reaction, even for a few seconds, they gain a choice. Instead of reacting automatically, they can pause and ask, is this really judgment or am I interpreting it through my past? That moment of questioning is where transformation begins. Not because the external situation changed, but because perception changed. Now let's go deeper. Emotion is not just a feeling, it is a biological process. Every emotional state creates chemistry in the body. Stress hormones, heart rate changes, breathing patterns, all of these shift depending on what we are experiencing internally. This means that when a family is in conflict, it is not just a mental disagreement, it is a shared biological environment of stress. And stress narrows perception. When people are stressed, they do not think clearly. They become defensive, reactive, and less able to understand alternative perspectives. This is why arguments often escalate. It is not only about words, it is about nervous system states interacting with each other. Now imagine what happens when even one person in that system becomes calm and aware. Their nervous system begins to regulate differently, their tone changes, their breathing slows, their presence becomes less threatening. And this shift can influence the entire interaction because human beings naturally attune to one another emotionally. This is not abstract theory, it is how human biology is designed. We regulate each other, we affect each other, we mirror each other. This brings us to an important insight. Families are not collections of isolated individuals. They are emotional ecosystems. And in any ecosystem, small changes can create large effects over time. So, what can we actually do with this understanding in daily life? First, we begin by noticing our automatic interpretations. When you feel triggered by someone in your family, pause and ask yourself, what story am I telling myself right now? This simple question creates distance between you and your reaction. That distance is awareness. Second, we learn to separate emotion from identity. Instead of saying, I am angry, try noticing anger is present in me right now. This small shift reminds the mind that emotions are experiences, not definitions of who you are. Third, practice curiosity instead of assumption. When conflict arises, replace conclusions with questions. Instead of assuming you understand the other person's intention, ask something simple like, what did you mean by that? Curiosity weakens the silo. Assumption strengthens it. Fourth, pay attention to your nervous system state. If your body is tense, your mind will interpret everything through tension. Before responding in difficult conversations, take a moment to breathe slowly and relax your shoulders. This is not just relaxation, it is changing the biological foundation of perception. Finally, remember that change in relationships rarely happens through big dramatic moments. It happens through small, consistent shifts, one calmer response, one more patient listening moment, one less reaction driven by old patterns. Over time, these small shifts accumulate, and accumulation changes systems. When we step back and look at families through this lens, we begin to see something deeply important. Most conflicts are not failures of love, they are signals of unconscious patterns interacting. Behind every argument is a human being trying to be understood. Behind every withdrawal is a human being trying to feel safe. When we see this clearly, something softens inside us. Judgment becomes less automatic, understanding becomes more possible, and we begin to realize that the real work is not about fixing other people, but about becoming more aware of how we participate in the shared emotional field. Because in the end, families do not transform through control. They transform through awareness. And awareness begins in the simple act of noticing what is happening within us right here, right now. Before we become the reaction, before we become the story, and before we forget that in every moment, we always have a chance to choose presence over pattern, understanding over assumption, and connection over separation.